There's been a lot of discourse about the feminism, or lack thereof, of Poor Things 2023, the film directed by Yorgos Lanthimos. Everything from the way the film presents the Born Sexy Yesterday trope with Bella Baxter as the main character, to the way the camera and the film treats sex and sexuality, female sexuality, to prostitution in the French brothel house. There's a lot that can be said about what this film does or doesn't do right by feminism. But as a book girly, I am more concerned with the actual text of Poor Things by Alasdair Gray, the 1992 novel, in relationship to this adaptation by Lanthimos, written by, I think, 3 male screenwriters who adapted the book. I wanted to make this video because I wanted to analyze the ways that the film really misses crucial aspects of the book that makes it, comparatively to the original text, much less feminist than what Alasdair Gray's themes are ultimately getting at. And I'm sorry, you can hear the cicadas outside. You know, they are louder now this year than I've ever remembered before in my life, I swear to God. But yes, forgive the background noise of the chirping of the cicadas. Full spoilers ahead. I'm talking about the movie, I'm talking about the book. If you don't want to know what happens in the book or what happens in the movie, click out, watch the movie, read the book, and you can come back here and, know my thoughts. The beginning of the novel itself already sets the tone for the importance of the unreliable narrator and perspective. The first paragraph of the novel begins with introduction. The doctor who wrote this account of his early experiences died in 1911, and readers who know nothing about the daringly experimental history of Scottish medicine will perhaps mistake it for a grotesque fiction. Those who examine the proofs given at the end of this introduction will not doubt that in the final week of February 1881 at 18 Park Circus, Glasgow, a surgical genius used human remains to create a 25-year-old woman. The local historian Michael Donnelly disagrees with me. It was he who salvaged the text, which is the biggest part of the book, so I must say how he found it. Alright, so here we already have a first-person narrator, I point of view text that introduces the story of Bella Baxter. But there's already a lack of straightforwardness in this presentation, in this introduction. There is I, the author of this introduction, the speaking voice, Alasdair Gray, or rather Alasdair Gray, a fictional writer of this introduction and compilation of this story and the text surrounding it. There's the perspective of that authorial voice, which is, this is a true story. But then we are introduced to Michael Donnelly, who actually found the original text and who is a historian. And he does not believe that the claims that are being made in this book and the tale that is being told of Bella Baxter's life was actually as it was told. There's this lack of straightforwardness right off the bat that makes this book so compelling. When I say Poor Things as a story, I'm actually talking about 3 things at once. Poor Things 2023, the Yorgos Lanthimos movie. Poor Things 1992, the Alasdair Gray novel. And by the way, Alasdair Gray died in 2019, so I don't think he played an active role in the finalization and the construction of this film. I think that Alasdair Gray's original text already shows the ambiguity of perspective within the first paragraph of the book, introduction. And the 3 different Poor Things I'm talking about, the film, the book, and then Poor Things, the book within the book, which the story of Poor Things that the film represents straight up is what in the book is called Episodes from the Early Life of a Scottish Public Health Officer by Archibald McCandless, MD. So McCandless is the writer of the Poor Things story that we see in the film. And the Poor Things story in the book is the story of McCandless telling Bella Baxter's life, the one that we see on the film, couched between this introduction by Alasdair Gray and footnotes and historical citations by Alasdair Gray, as well as an addendum by Victoria/Bella herself. Essentially, how the structure of the book is, the table of contents is introduction by Alasdair Gray, episodes from the early life of the Scottish Public Health Officer, McCandless, a letter about the book to a grand or great-grandchild by Victoria, and this is put in quotes in the book, Victoria McCandless, MD. Then, chapter notes, historical and critical, by Alasdair Gray. And there's illustrations throughout the novel as well. But basically, the book presents the story of Bella Baxter's life within a really specific perspective of McCandless writing it. That is crucial, because the film instead presents everything from this sort of objective third-party standpoint of the camera, of the viewer. We're seeing what is actually happening. It is never brought into question that what is happening on screen is what is actually happening in terms of the adventures that Bella goes on, the experiences she has, the surgical treatment, and all of that. That is presented as, yes, this is what Bella Baxter's life looks like. But in the book, poor things, not so. Very much not so. And that is specifically addressed in the letter written by Victoria McCandless at the very end of the book. In the structure of the novel itself, it's already making multiple claims. One claim is that this is a true story and this is a historical recounting of what actually occurred based off of a couple primary texts. One of them being episodes from The Early Life of the Scottish Public Health Officer by Max McCandless, and then another primary text being Victoria McCandless' A Letter to My Grand or Great-Grandchild. These two primary sources are couched between an introduction written by Alasdair Gray and a footnotes, chapter notes, historical notes at the end after Victoria's letter. It is very clear throughout the writing of the text that McCandless is presenting all of this from his perspective. It's this subjective reality that he is convincing the reader to believe as objective and true. It's a lot of like, oh, this doesn't seem true, but I promise you this is exactly what happened. And then this tale of his future wife, Bella Baxter, how he met her, how he started a relationship with her, and all of that is presented somewhat accurately in the film of McCandless' relationship with Godwin, and then how McCandless gets introduced to Bella Baxter. Some things are different, but the general gist of it is kind of the same. Because the book itself is couched between these footnotes, these historical addendums, and other things in this introduction, and also the writing of the text itself of the episodes from a life are very much rooted in the voice of Max McCandless, this I voice, this man narrating the life of a woman. It's very clear what is happening here. The book makes it quite obvious, I think, that everything is being filtered through his perspective and his understanding of reality. The film, however, is not able to do that, or it doesn't do that. It doesn't play with perspective in that manner. It doesn't play with an unreliable narrator in this way, because everything's presented in a very like, yes, this is what happened. And at the same time, part of how like Hollywood and cinema works is that you have to have a cast. McCandless writes of like Bella's beauty, but in the film, Bella, cast as Emma Stone, is presented as like this stunningly gorgeous, beautiful young woman. And the book describes her as such as well, but like, because the book is being written, the story of Bella Baxter's life, the episodes from a Scottish whatever, McCandless' perspective of her being the most gorgeous woman ever who everyone is falling over their heads to lust after, again, comes from his perspective. Like, we don't actually know what Bella Baxter looks like per se, we just know that he views her as this beautiful vixen sex icon, but in the Born Sexy Yesterday, sexy baby sort of construction. So, as readers, you are kind of invited to question within the introduction of the novel and then within McCandless' recounting itself, the integrity of this narrative as more and more bizarre things occur. Hollywood and the camera necessitates the fact of Bella being gorgeous and beautiful and alluring, but that takes away from the importance of that unreliable narrator and perspective that the book is so rooted in. I think the most interesting and compelling part of Poor Things by Alasdair Gray is a letter about the book to a grand or great-grandchild by Victoria McCandless, MD. That is put right after the episodes from the early life of the Scottish Public Health Officer that tells the story of Bella Baxter, which is what we see in the film. In this letter, who we know as Bella Baxter says these words: Dear grand or great-grandchild, by 1974, my 3 strong, sprouting lads will be dead or senile, so all other surviving members of the McCandles dynasty have 2 grandfathers, or 4 great-grandfathers, and will easily laugh at the aberration of one. I cannot laugh at this book. I shudder at it and thank the life force that my late husband had just this single copy printed and bound. I have burned every scrap I could find of the original manuscript, and would have burned this too, as he suggests in his verse on the flyleaf, but alas, it is almost the only evidence left that the poor fool existed. He also paid a small fortune for it, enough to feed, clothe, and educate 12 orphans for a year. The illustrations must have doubled the printing costs. The portrait of me is copied from one in an illustrated newspaper of 1896, and strikes me as a good likeness. If you ignore the Gainsborough hat and pretentious nickname, it shows I am a plain, sensible woman, not the naive Lucrezia Borgia and La Belle Dame sans Merci described in the text. So I post the book to posterity. I do not care what posterity thinks of it, as long as nobody now living connects it with me. I married Archibald McCandles because he was convenient, and as years slipped by, I came to like and rely upon the man. He was not much use to anyone else. He calls his book Episodes from the Early Life of a Scottish Public Health Officer. He was a Glasgow municipal health officer for exactly 11 months, resigning from the job as soon as he became chairman of the Glasgow Civic Improvement Trust. Our investments, not his brilliant mind, got him that position. Basically, then she goes to recount the way that her husband was working away at this manuscript towards the end of his life, or their life together, and she is talking about how she thinks, and as we can see from the whole, instead of printing this book, we could have fed 12 orphans. She is someone who wants to give back to people, and she wants to help people. She is MD, she's a doctor, she is a socialist, a labor organizer, and a suffragette. She is someone who firmly believes in these things, these causes, and not only believes in them, but works really hard towards making them a reality and manifesting them in her life and creating the world that she wants. But she views her husband as a self-aggrandizing figure who doesn't care about things that actually matter, and instead is telling these fantastical tales to their children and whatnot. She recounts the conversations that she had with him and how he was working away at this manuscript and then eventually brought it to her like a dog with a squirrel in its mouth and was like, you like? And she was like, fuck no, obviously. She does not fuck with it. She tells the story of her life in a much shorter manner, in a very autobiographical, straight up way, with a lot of all caps. Another man might do it better. When she's talking about her affairs and the things that we had just read within the book and what we had just seen in the film as her life, she says, okay, he talks about this, but this is what actually happened. You guys think this, but this is my life, and here is my story. Talks about the one true love of her life, and the way that McCandles wasn't it, obviously, how her will was subverted, her desires were negated for the sake of many different things outside of her control, and yet she still works towards the control over things that she does have. She writes, "You, dear reader, have now 2 accounts to choose between, and there can be no doubt which is most probable. My second husband's story positively stinks of all that was morbid in that most morbid of centuries, the 19th. He has made a sufficiently strange story stranger still by stirring into it episodes and phrases to be found in Hogg's Suicide Grave, with additional ghouleries from the works of Mary Shelley and Edgar Allan Poe. What morbid Victorian fantasy has he not, all caps, filched from? I find traces of the coming race, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dracula, Trilby, Rider Haggard's She, the casebook of Sherlock Holmes, and alas, Alice Through the Looking Glass, a gloomier book than the sunlit Alice in Wonderland. He has even plagiarized work by 2 very dear friends, G.B. Shaw's Pygmalion and the scientific romances of Herbert George Wells. Ever since reading this infernal parody of my life story, I have been asking, all caps, why did Archie write it? I am now able to post this letter to posterity, because I have at last found the answer. As locomotive engines are driven by pressurized steam, so the mind of Archibald McCandles was driven by carefully hidden envy. His good fortune in later life never stopped him being at heart just a poor bastard bairn. The envy the poor and exploited feel towards the wealthy is a good thing if it works towards reforming this unfairly ordered nation. That is why we Fabians think the trade unions and Labour Party are as much our allies as any honest public servant, liberal or Tory, who wants a decent minimum wage, a sanitary house, proper working conditions, and the vote for every British adult. Unluckily, my Archie envied the only two people he loved, the only two who could tolerate him. He envied God for having a famous father and tender loving mother. He resented my wealthy father, convent education, and famous first husband, resented my superior social graces. Most of all, he envied the care and company God gave me, and the strength of my love for God, and hated the fact that the most we felt for him was friendly goodwill tempered on my side with sensual indulgence. So, in his last months, he soothed himself by imagining a world where he and God and I existed in perfect equality. Having had a childhood which privileged people would have thought no childhood, he wrote a book suggesting that God had none either, that God had always been as Archie knew him, because Sir Colin had manufactured God by the Frankenstein method, Sir Colin being Godwin's father, who, in the film, and in Archibald McCandless recounting in his episodes of an early life, he's seen as like deformed in this way, tortured by his father, Sir Colin. Because Sir Colin had manufactured God by the Frankenstein method, then he deprived me of childhood and schooling by suggesting I was not mentally me when I first met him, but my baby daughter. Having invented this equality of deprivation for all of us, he could then easily describe how I loved him at first sight and how Godwin envied him. But of course, Archie was no lunatic. He knew his book was a cunning lie. When chuckling over it during his last few weeks, what amused him was how cleverly his fiction outwitted the truth. Or so I believe. Yet why did he not make it more convincing? In the 22nd chapter describing how my first husband shot me through the foot, he says, "The bullet had luckily gone clean through into the carpet," all caps, puncturing the integument between the ulna and radius of the second and third metacarpals, without even chipping a bone. The capitalized words might just convince someone who knows nothing of anatomy, but they are blethers, havers, claptrap, gibberish, gobbledygook, and since Archie cannot have forgotten his medical training to that extent, he must have known it. He could have easily had said, puncturing the tendon of the oblique head of adductor hallucis between the great and index proximal phalanges without chipping a bone, because that was what happened. But I have no time to go through every page separating fact from fiction. If you ignore what contradicts common sense and this letter, you will find that this book records some actual events during a dismal era. As I said before, to my nostrils, the book stinks of Victorianism. It is as sham Gothic as the Scott Monument, Glasgow University, St. Pancras Station, and the Houses of Parliament. I hate such structures. Their useless over-ornamentation was paid for out of needlessly high profits squeezed from the stunted lives of children, women, and men working more than 12 hours a day, 6 days a week in needlessly, all caps, filthy factories. For by the 19th century, we had the knowledge to make things cleanly. We did not use it. The huge profits of the owning classes were too sacred to be questioned. To me, this book stinks as the interior of a poor woman's crinoline must have stunk after a cheap weekend railway excursion to the Crystal Palace. I realize I am taking it too seriously, but I am thankful to have survived into the 20th century. So, there we go. Victoria/Bella is contending with, as a character, in the film, which is not shown, and in this book, which is, if you, read past the story that McCandless writes, that this is a ridiculous tale and bastardization of her life. Bella characterizes her husband McCandless as ridiculous for a number of reasons, calling the book that he wrote about her a macabre Gothic fantasy version of her life that was written in his perspective through his own psychological bullshit and projection. At the end of the manuscript by McCandless, the true episodes of the life, we see the back cover of the book. So it's a book within a book, obviously, but the back cover of the book, McCandless has written in script, "Please remember me sometimes." So that begs the question, is he, McCandless, speaking to us as the reader of the story? Is he speaking to Victoria, who he knows didn't really love him the way that she loved other things and people? I mean, I think it's probably both. He's begging for his story to be told, and I think Lanthimos told his story, and straight up, with no alteration, no imposition of his perspective. That is what makes the book the way that it is within the novel. Whether, Alasdair Gray in the introductory text being like, Bella Baxter being constructed by this surgical genius this is the true story of her life as recorded by McCandless, or the historian George Donnelly being like, no, that's all bullshit. like, we can see the actual genealogy of this family history and, like, who Victoria was, who her husband was, etc. Her own words, right? We don't get her own words. We don't get Bella Baxter's perspective in the movie of this angle of, like, that was not my story, and my story to tell is one of labor organizing and helping the poor and sick and orphaned. We get a tinge of that in the scene where she, like, sees Alexandria in Egypt in the destitute poverty when she looks down upon those people and then gets scammed by those sailors because she has a good heart. The naivete that scene plays up is there to emphasize the immaturity and lack of development of this character. Whereas in the book, she has more autonomy and authority than that. She says, "But I am thankful to have survived into the 20th century." Herbert George Wells, that honey-smelling man, published a book called The War in the Air. H.G.'s book is a warning, of course, not a prediction. He and I, and many others, expect a better future because we are actively creating it. Glasgow is an exciting place for a dedicated socialist. Even in its earlier liberal phase, it set the world an example through the municipal development of public resources. After Victoria's letter at the end, which is piercing, insulting the whole nature of the story, there's all these footnotes that Alasdair Gray has inserted that are citations, talking as if this book is a work of historical fact, a primary source to be interrogated. There's all these, graphs and photos and figures that illustrate the different things of this era, the references being made, the political reality of this world, and then Victoria McCandless's legacy. She's called Dr. Vic by people. People are astounded that she has 3 children and is married because of all of the political work that she does, and the fact that she is a practicing doctor. The way that her reputation is proliferated through her community as an addendum after her own recounting of her life in the letter. The final endnote and the last page of the book that isn't, this picture at the very end, and right before the about the author and editor, after all of these different primary sources and secondary sources being cited in these footnotes of the text, we get this final paragraph. Dr. Victoria McCandless was found dead of a cerebral stroke on 3rd December 1946. Reckoning from the birth of her brain in the Humane Society mortuary on Glasgow Green, 18th February 1880, she was exactly 66 years, 40 weeks, and 4 days old. Reckoning from the birth of her body in a Manchester slum in 1854, she was 92. So, again, the book ends on this note that provides these 2 diverging stories. Was she 66 years old when she died because of the fact of her brain being, 20 years, 30 years younger than her body? Or was she 92 and 92 in the brain as well? We don't know. We have these differing facts that tell us different information. We get McCandless's perspective. We get Victoria's perspective. And we, as readers, are left to think about, who do we believe? What do we think is what actually happened? The fact that the structure of the book is introduction, episodes of the life, Victoria's letter, footnotes that include a lot of Victoria's later life work, quotes about her in the newspaper and her political involvement, and the call-out posts that were being made in newspapers about her, like Dr. Victoria McCandless's secret Bolshevik organization or something like that, right? Delightful, in my opinion. All of this points to something that the film really lacks, a playfulness with perspectives and truth. The film is playful in its tonal quality, in the style of the narrative, in Emma Stone's embodiment of Bella Baxter, but it doesn't play with perspective and truth. The book allows your own ethics and beliefs to ultimately shape what you think happened. The movie just shows you what happened, but did it? It never asks you that question outright. A huge deviation from the novel. That was one of the most disappointing parts of the movie to me, was I was already less interested in the idea of, is this a feminist text or not, because I went into the film believing that the book itself is this really interestingly constructed feminist socialist text in a lot of ways, and I knew that there was it was inevitable that was going to seep into the narrative of the film, but I really just did not expect the level of unengagement with the actual text of the story, because with the question of can male directors depict female stories in a way that is like empowering or feminist or whatever, and can male authors write women's stories in a way that isn't reductive and bad, like, I think Alasdair Gray wins on that front. Like, he wins over Lanthimos in terms of the portrayal of this story, right? I will link 2 different videos that I watched about, or I think 3 different videos I watched about Poor Things the film and Poor Things the book in the description, because one of them is a video that compares the book to the film in a very straightforward, literal sense. I think the person who made that video, she did a great job of illustrating the side-by-side comparisons of what is in the book and what's in the movie. So all props to her for doing that. I'm also thinking about this video essay about the feminist discourses surrounding this movie and the ways that it falls flat in presenting but not critiquing the ideas that are present. Shout out to those people. Those opinions have definitely informed mine. To go back to the structure of the story in the book, the introduction, after you finish reading the whole book and you revisit the introduction, you start thinking, you know, like, how much of this narrator in the introduction is rooted in, like, his belief in a great miracle of science, his desire for that to be true, and his desire to be able to view a figure of history as a great man of history. Maybe that is what informs the way that he firmly believes that McCandless's recounting of Bella's birth is what it is, as opposed to Victoria's recounting of her life story. Perhaps the narrator in the introduction, who is Alasdair Gray, the fictional Alasdair Gray, you know. There's a lot of literary theory that goes into the distinction between the authorial voice of a writer and then the writer as a person themselves. And I'm not even going to touch all of that because, like, that's a lot of stuff that I don't think I have the expertise in. And that gets into the female Frankenstein-like nature of this story. First of all, I think, you know, the novel Frankenstein itself is already, like, female in the fact that it was written by Mary Shelley. It's interesting because Frankenstein is written by Mary Shelley about 2 men, ultimately Dr. Frankenstein and the monster he creates, whereas Alasdair Gray's novel here is about 2 women, 2 versions of Victoria McCandless / Bella Baxter. And the literal construction of this woman as a scientific, macabre, Victorian Gothic thing, and her literal existence. You know, the construction of her versus the construction of her character, the literal construction of her body and her mind, the manipulations of the men in her life around that, versus, like, her authority and deeply held sense of self and beliefs that we do see in this letter and in the addendums. With regards to Frankenstein, like, Shelley is really playing on the fears of her time in writing that novel, which is, you know, the first science fiction novel written by a woman, yay. The first science fiction novel ever in the Anglophone canon, from what I understand, which happened to be written by a woman, so, you know, fuck the speculative fiction, sci-fi, fantasy bros who don't fuck with women, you know. One of the many themes of Frankenstein as a novel that is, like, really compelling about it is that it is a product of its time. It plays on these ideas of technology, of deviance, these things that are coming into question and light within the age of enlightenment and the scientific revolution. This is the backdrop to which her story, it's a political and epistemological sort of background that grounds Shelley's novel. In Poor Things, the importance of these rapid political changes and the shift from the dark 19th century into an enlightened 20th century that Victoria writes as she feels so blessed to have lived into is something that is, like, a crucial element of this book that isn't really explored in the film in terms of thinking about this era as, like, a concrete manifestation of the political realities of this world. It kind of touches on it and it shoulders on by it, but through its presentation of it. But again, it's a straight up presentation. It's a straightforward, literal representation of Victorian wealth and poverty and gender and performance that doesn't necessarily critique it within its own text, something that Final Girl Studios mentions in her video. And we can see the importance of the era of the time that this book is being written and told and the story is being told within the second paragraph of Poor Things by Alasdair Gray. The very second paragraph after the introductory first paragraph that I read to you at the beginning of this video. Life in Glasgow was very exciting during the 1970s. So again, within the first page of the book, we know this is a book about the 1970s, but also in the century past. You know, what was happening in this Victorian era? What is our understanding of making memory and making truth of history? Like, the book asks these questions that the film does not really touch. Alasdair Gray, in his novel Poor Things, constructs an altered and resurrected human of the contemporary postmodern age, in the way that Shelley, in her novel, constructs an altered and resurrected human of her age, of her era, right? And I think because Alasdair Gray died in 2019, so he couldn't have been that involved in the making of the film and the screenplay, that's why the story of the film falls flat when it comes to trying to tackle and discuss these deeply contemporary issues and themes of feminism and social realities and sex and women that Poor Things by Alasdair Gray gets at in a more nuanced manner. And more importantly, I think the biggest theme throughout the structure of this novel, the framing device of this novel, is the question of, like, what is truth? How do we find it? This is like a very postmodern question itself, right? A post-structural question. A 1970s question, right? Of literary theory and the things that people were thinking about in revisionist history. The revisionist history era of the 1960s and 70s of understanding the past through a more critical, feminist, race-oriented, populist manner rather than from the great man of history perspective. We see, like, these are the ideas and ideological forces that are clashing in the book. You know, what is truth? How do we find it? In an age where there's so much information and it's filtered through secondary sources and hearsay and the writings and perspectives and objectives of different people, as we see through all the footnotes and the addendums and the perspectives portrayed in Poor Things by Alasdair Gray. How do we understand truth through all of this information, especially when it's filtered through these secondary sources that use an imposed, like, tone of objectivity and straightforwardness of things presented as objective truth? Judith Butler, in their new introduction to their, like, most famous book about gender, I'm forgetting what it is, Butler writes something about the fact that, like, people critique Butler's writing for its complexity and its unnecessary denseness or whatever, and to that Butler says, I'm paraphrasing, I don't want to go find the quote right now, when Judith Butler talks about how Nixon will straight up lie to your face using very simple words, saying that this is the objective truth and reality, what does that hide? That itself is an obscurity of the truth. When we use complex language and narratives and storytelling to try to get at complicated ideas and matters and truth, like, we're going to use the sort of language and complexity and layered depth that we should to address those topics. And I think this sort of represents what I'm saying about the straightforwardness and the straight-up nature of the film versus the book. One of them is Nixon telling you what's happening to the camera, saying this is the truth, and one of them is Judith Butler being like, so do we see how someone looking at you in the camera and telling you that this is the truth doesn't mean it's true? In fact, it often tells you that it's very false and there's a lot going on behind the scenes that they don't want you to know about. That's really how I feel about these two texts in relation to each other. What the book gets at in this reciprocal manner between reader and text that the film attempts to do between viewer and film, in the way that it's been generating all this discourse about, like, is it feminist, is it not feminist, is it good, is it bad, what is it actually saying, that type of thing. The book does that with the reader, but in a much more, like, subtle and intellectually interesting way. Who do we believe? How do we as readers deal with the complexities of a real human woman within the scope of the novel, speaking about her experiences, which are included as an addendum to a story constructed and written by a man? How do we understand her experiences when it's filtered through the structure of the novel, the story that Archibald McCandless writes himself, and then the historical notes that are sourced throughout? This story itself being dug up and presented by men to an audience within the canon of the story itself is something that Victoria McCandles never would have wanted to have happen. She says in that letter, thank God this was only printed once because I don't want anyone to have to read this. But, we do, and we are. And now we are left with this question of, now that we have this information, what do we believe? How do we think about women who are both a product of our society and constructed by the men in her life, and someone who has the authority and identity of herself as a full embodied person? And that is what makes the book a story of the every woman in this sort of utopian ideal from a patriarchal standpoint, right? We all live under patriarchy. As women, we are a product of a society that imposes gender and gendered expectations onto us, and patriarchal oppression and sexual exploitation. How do we deal with that? And what is our truth and ourselves and our identities when it is up against all of these forces? How do we get our voices and stories told? I think, Emma Stone's co-production of this film kind of somewhat answers that question in a very cynical and pessimistic light, which is like, we can only do it insofar as people who are watching us like us for our faces and what we look like and our sex appeal. Like, Victoria McCandles writes in the beginning of her letter, you can see that I am a plain looking woman. I'm practical, and I'm not this stunning beauty that everyone was falling over their feet for. She talks about all her romantic dalliances, including the sapphic one. The way that she... let me go find that. Can you guys tell that I love this book? I was talking so much, I was like, let me put on a fresh coat of lip gloss so I can really get into this. This is, if you're interested, I'm wearing NYX Butter Gloss in the shade Lava Cake over the Makeup Forever Artist Color Pencil in full red. But that's probably worn off. Anyway, back to feminism, I guess. In her recounting of why and how she married McCandles, she says, I had never been kissed by a man before. My only amorous pleasures had been a sapphic affair with my piano teacher in Lausanne. I would have loved her till the end of time, but alas, she loved too many others for my selfish taste, so I had turned against her. I was amazed by the enjoyment I got from McCandles. When we separated, I gazed at him with the emotion verging on respect. When he proposed marriage, I agreed and said, let us tell God at once. In the book, Victoria says that her one true love was God and Godwin, but he was never going to, he was never going to pursue that with her no matter how much she wanted it, so she's settling. McCandles is her, second choice at best. She's okay. He's weak enough with not that strong of a will enough for me to be able to manipulate him. Is her perspective. But again, not just considering Victoria's perspective that is inserted very crucially in the book, we can also even just look at the introduction of Victoria McCandles / Bella Baxter in the introduction itself, where the narrator is telling us, okay, this is what happened, this is what I believe, this is what Connolly, the historian, believes. The first mention of Victoria / Bella goes like this, quote, Michael saw the name of the first woman doctor to graduate from Glasgow University, a name only known to historians of the suffragette movement nowadays, though she had once written a Fabian pamphlet on public health. We don't get her name, but we get her accomplishments. Feminism, am I right? In the movie, our first introduction to Bella is the back of her as she's jumping into the Thames. Here, our introduction to her, prefacing the story, is she was a doctor and the first female doctor to graduate from Glasgow University. That's the most important information for us as the reader in the moment of her introduction, in the moment of the main character's introduction in this text. But the main character's introduction in the movie is her taking her own life and then becoming lobotomized. Connolly, in the historian in the book, discovered her through her accomplishments rather than her body being literally washed up and discovered and taken by body snatchers. Again, already reframes the narrative. Compared to the film, is much more about a woman in her entirety than what the film is doing. So, in conclusion, as you can tell from this very long video, I'm sure, I think that Alasdair Gray's 1992 novel, Poor Things, is superior in almost every way I guess, to the film, as much as you can compare two mediums to each other, right? The film has so much going for it. It's amazing. I love the movie, I'm gonna be honest. I have a whole episode on Patreon for my podcast, Lavender Menace, where me and my co-host talk about this film, and how my podcast co-host, Renaissance, who has been on the channel before with me, real ones know, they don't like the film for the way that it does, like, feminism, or doesn't do it. And I was really, in the moment of recording for this bonus episode on Patreon, I was really still thinking about this movie in relationship to the book, and giving it, I think, more grace than the film, more grace and political importance than it necessarily deserved from the text itself. I do have to credit the creation of this video to you guys who were commenting on some of my previous videos about how you would really love to see a side-by-side comparison and analysis from me about these two texts, the adaptation and the original one. So I hope this sufficed. I hope you enjoyed. But yeah, those are really my thoughts, and that's, I guess, my review of the book and movie in relationship to each other. If you want to know more of my thoughts on the film, where I go into all the different things that I loved about it, you should join my Lavender Menace Patreon and watch that bonus episode. We also talk about the Grammys and stuff there. But anyways, that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. If you're still here with me, drop a like, drop a comment, and I would say, if you're at this part of the video, in your comment, include the syringe emoji, the one that's like a needle. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video. Bye!